I'm talking about the Muslim world. I want to talk just a little bit about Muslim society. The period under the Abbasids in particular, from the mid 700s until the mid 1200s, was really a period of glorious cultural flowering under Muslim society. Now, if you wanted to look at the whole world and world history, if you wanted to point to say who was the most technologically advanced country up until the 900s or so, it would have to be China for most of that time period. And I'll talk about that more later in a different lecture. But beginning in the 900s or so, the Muslim world made a really strong case for making a claim to have matched or maybe even gone beyond China in terms of technological, artistic, philosophical advancements, etc. And the reason for that is that the Muslim world stretched a really long distance, and it was connecting a number of different cultural traditions. First of all, the Muslims, when they conquered much of the Byzantine Empire, in particular Egypt, they captured huge treasure troves of Roman and Greek writings. And in particular, the library at Alexandria had been this major center of learning, and there were still enormous caches of documents in Egypt of Aristotle and Plato and Euclid and Galen and Aristophanes and Sophocles and so the Muslims inherited that, right? The second thing is that they were in contact with India. They conquered a significant chunk of India, and they would be in constant contact with India. And so a number of advances from India, in particular, the development of what we would call Arabic numerals, actually came from India, and Arabs borrowed that from them. And so a lot of Arabs basically took Indian mathematics, which had this great numeral system and rules about arithmetic, etc., and they connected it to Greek mathematics, which had been about geometry, and they developed this fantastic new branch of mathematics called algebra, which is actually just the Arabic word algebra, the calculation. And so they develop algebra as this brand new branch of mathematics because they had connected India and Greece. And then they were also in contact with China, and the Muslim world, in particular, they made enormous advances in medicine in terms of figuring out human anatomy, diagnosing disease, figuring out certain medicines, and they were drawing on the Greek and Roman tradition of medicine, but also adding to it knowledge that they had from other parts of the world, and from China, from India, etc. And in terms of philosophy, they developed this. They preserved all the writings of Aristotle and Plato, etc. And I want to point out, most of the writings of Aristotle and Plato disappeared from Europe in the Middle Ages. Europeans simply didn't save them, but the Muslim world did. And Muslim philosophers engaged with Aristotle and Plato and all the other Greek philosophers and really responded to that and developed new critiques and new extensions of Greek philosophy. And so they kept that alive. In addition, they also developed fantastic new forms of art. One of the interesting things is, like Persia had a long tradition of poetry and literature, and when the Arabs conquered Persia, they essentially started, the Arabian Peninsula had its own tradition of oral poetry, and those two traditions combined and developed into a really interesting new forms of literature, often in the Persian language, but sometimes in Arabic. And then in Spain, you also saw this enormous flowering of the sort of blending of Jewish and Christian and Muslim culture in Spain led to this enormous flowering of literature and poetry, etc., and whole new forms of Hebrew poetry as well as Arabic poetry as these different cultural traditions influence each other, and fantastic forms of architecture and art, etc., in Spain developed also. And so this Muslim world was wealthy and powerful and sophisticated and advanced, and in some ways they had a good claim to being the most technologically advanced and sophisticated society in the world at that time period, although the Chinese could still make a good claim to that also. Now, the foundation of Muslim society was Sharia, which is Muslim holy law. And Sharia is ultimately based on the Quran and Hadith. And the idea here is that the Quran is very explicit about a number of things like inheritance law and marriage and things like that. But then there are other places where it's not as explicit. And if the Quran does not mention something, then you can look at Hadith and see if the Hadith have any guidance for you. And if the Hadith doesn't have anything, then you have to figure out how to create law that is in harmony with the Quran and Hadith. And so there are a number of ways you can do that. And in fact, there are four schools of law, major schools of law in the Sunni world and then in the Shia world. I should mention that the Muslim world is divided today and was divided early on between Sunnis and Shia. And I'm not going to go on all the differences here, but about 90% of the Muslim world is Sunni and about 10% is Shia. Basically, Iran is predominantly Shia Muslim, but there are Shia communities in nearby countries like Syria and Iraq and Lebanon. But the majority of the population is Sunni. So there are four Sunni schools of law for how you interpret law if it's not explicit in the Quran and Hadith. And then there are Shia schools for how you interpret law if it's not explicit in the Quran and Hadith. But the gist of it is that you can do a couple of different types of reasoning. The first is you can look at is there a similar ruling in the Quran that you could somehow extend? So, for instance, if you're wondering about inheritance rules for distant cousins and grandchildren, you look at how the inheritance rules for sons and daughters, which are explicit in the Quran, work, and then you say, okay, we're going to apply that sort of thinking to grandchildren, etc. Another way is sort of analogous thinking. You could say, for instance, how do we come up with a law about who owns corporations and how you handle joint stock companies? Well, we have this inheritance law, so we can maybe use an analogy from that to talk about corporations. Another way is that you can look at the community. One of the accepted ways in a number of these schools of law is that you say, well, if the Quran and Hadith don't say anything, how does the community of Muslims traditionally handle this? How have we been doing it? Because the assumption is that the community has, in some sense, if they're striving to be good Muslims, they're going to be striving towards God's will. And so the community can sort of shape the law in some sense. So Sharia is the idea that the foundation of a Muslim society is the law, and the law is based on the Quran first and foremost, and then the Hadith, and then these other sorts of reasoning based on community traditions or analogous reasoning, etc. But what about Christians and Jews? Well, it's kind of interesting that Muhammad was very explicit that Christians and Jews were people of the book, as he said it. And what he meant by that was that God had chosen the Jews as his original chosen people, and he had given his message to Abraham and Moses and etc., and all the other prophets. And then God had given his message to Jesus, and Christians were therefore the chosen people by God. Now, they had all misinterpreted the law, and Muhammad claimed that his message from God superseded all the previous ones and that his was correct. And so in theory, Christians and Jews should convert to Islam, although Muslims are not going to force them to. Instead, Muhammad said, Christians and Jews must be allowed to practice their religion in peace because they are people of the book, the holy book of God, and they are the chosen people of God. Even though they're mistaken, they still were the chosen people of God and have received God's message, so we should leave them alone. So Christians and Jews, now there were ways in which Christians and Jews had certain disadvantages. They often had to pay extra taxes because they weren't Muslim. They weren't allowed to inherit property from Muslims. When they got married, they had to convert to if they got married to a Muslim, they had to convert to Islam. The Muslim couldn't convert to Christianity or Judaism. So there are all sorts of restrictions, but it was clear that Christians and Jews were to be allowed to practice their religion without persecution in Muslim society. This brings up an interesting side note, which is gender, which is that in the Arab world before Islam, it was a very patriarchal society. Women generally couldn't inherit property. Men could have multiple wives. They could women didn't hold positions of authority or power, and so that was sort of the foundation. But Muhammad was actually seen as a sort of gender progressive because he actually said in the Quran and Hadith that girls should get a portion of the inheritance from their parents, and the girls control that. Now, they got a smaller portion than boys, but they got a portion. And it was very clear that when a woman got married, the wealth that she brought to her marriage, if there was a divorce, she took that wealth back again, right? And so there's a very strong sense that women could own property and that women had a stake in property that was not totally superseded by marriage. And Muhammad also said that in Arabic society, there was a lot of polygamy. Men could have dozens of wives. And Muhammad said, no, the maximum is 4. And in fact, you should only have 1 unless you really think you have the money and the time and the attention to give to 2 wives or 3 or 4. And there's no way anybody could give good attention and have a good marriage with more than 4 wives, so that's the limit. So he was seen as sort of a progressive on that sense. But what's really interesting is when the Muslim Arab conquerors spread out over North Africa and up into Syria and over into Egypt and then into Persia, they run into Byzantine and Sassanid societies that have really well-developed and complicated gender roles and gender norms. And Muslims often adopted those, right? You remember that in the tradition of Sharia, there's a strong component for doing what people did traditionally. And as Muslims begin ruling over these societies that have long traditions of gender roles, they begin to adopt those to a certain extent. And so what we think of today, Islam sort of has a bad reputation. Countries like Saudi Arabia didn't let women drive for a long time, and they don't let men and women who aren't married to each other sit in the same section of a restaurant, and they, have separate movie theaters, etc. So women have to wear head coverings and veils in various parts of the world, etc. And the Taliban are horrible to women. They don't let them get educations. They can't leave the house without a male escort, etc. So the Muslim world has a reputation for being bad on gender, and to a certain extent that's deserved. But the Muslim world has a wide variety of gender roles. There are lots of Muslims in the world today who see men and women as essentially equal. That they can get educations, they can hold jobs, etc. But the original gender discrimination that you see in a lot of parts of the Muslim world actually came, in many cases, from, say, Byzantine society or Persian society, that Muslim conquerors conquered Syria or Egypt, and they adopted Byzantine Greek ideas. For instance, veiling originally was a Greek idea for upper class women that Muslims adopted. And so in many cases, the ideas that we think about in gender terms for Islam are actually grafted onto Islam from other societies that Muslims conquered, which is kind of an interesting twist on what we normally think about it as. And so I don't want to make it sound like women in the Muslim world were equal. It was still a very patriarchal society. It was there were still no major female political leaders, etc. But in some ways, Muslim society was better to women, fairer to women than, say, Christian society or Persian society at the same time, or Chinese society, as we'll see with Ban Zhao. So that's lecture 11C.